Let's bring in our political editor now, Andrew Clennell, for more on this. Andrew, you were there for the news conference, and Scott Morrison adamant this was not about justifying his position, in particular on these call-out powers for the Army.
Yeah, but it's difficult to see it any other way. It just looks like there's two things he wants addressed, and he doesn't see the states, and particularly New South Wales, having done enough in the latest crisis or before the latest crisis. Tom, one's hazard reduction, as we spoke about. He has spoken before about the potential for naming and shaming states about whether they're hitting targets, whether they're doing enough hazard reduction. The other issue is calling in the Defence Force. He believes that Premier Gladys Berejiklian should have asked him for that on the South Coast in early January. He went and put them in and said we're moving forward and integrating at the time. And as much as he denies it, it's quite clear that this commission's about getting an outcome which can say that he or any other Prime Minister can call a national state of emergency, in which case the state's wishes can be disregarded and the Army can just be put in place. And I think there's probably some justification for that, given that there were people, as we spoke about a couple of hours ago, Tom, left without food and fuel on the South Coast, while the states was focused on the fire itself and all those massive fires, the Rural Fire Service. They weren't looking after some of the people on the ground stuck in the middle of it, and that will be the justification for a change to a national state of emergency here.
He wants to focus on this hazard reduction. It will be interesting to see, because the government, you know, if you talk about that, that's just a management issue. If you can improve that and we're safer, well, that's great. But how much expert evidence will there be that in the case of these types of fires, when you've got such drier, warmer conditions, how safe that is to do in these cooler months?
Well, I think we might even hear that a lot of hazard reduction has been done by the fires themselves. I mean, that will be one consideration, I reckon, Tom, that it might not be as urgent as it was a year or two ago, because so many hectares have been burnt out. But we'll wait and see on that one. I mean, I think there'll be enough people giving evidence suggesting the fuel load was high, and that was a contributor. Of course, climate change doesn't help with that. The Prime Minister says that himself. Longer, drier, hotter summers, and then you've got the trees there, the bush there. It's going to burn.
Meanwhile, Labor, in its own bit of news today, you were revealing to us that in January they actually made a decision on this 2050 net zero emissions. This is not the 2030 target that you'd expect them to still be ruminating over, but it's an interesting decision nonetheless, particularly given some in the party assumed they'd wait for the government to go first.
Very interesting, and Anthony Albanese announces that target that Labor aspires to tomorrow, zero net emissions 2050. Of course, the Business Council of Australia's pushed for this. Scott Morrison seems very reluctant to adopt it. I don't think he will, and he's preparing a report on how much it costs, which, as I said earlier this week, he can turn around and whack Labor with. Now, it was a full discussion of the Shadow Ministry, I understand, in January. It did go through unanimously. Even Joel Fitzgibbon, who's pretty much on the other side of the argument, I'm told, said he agreed with the target, but he expressed several concerns about what it might mean politically, and that maybe there wasn't enough meat on the bones in terms of actually achieving it. And Matt Keogh also raised concerns. So that's what I've heard about that discussion. You'd have to speculate, Tom, that the formation of the Otis Group, this group of Labor MPs under Fitzgibbon that is talking about protecting coal jobs and coal workers, was an initiative spurned out of this Shadow Ministry decision in January. So Mark Butler, the climate change spokesman, took this submission. He took CSIRO and Melbourne University advice to the Shadow Ministry. Some of that advice actually said there was a cost to not doing it, that you could create jobs from going with the target. But out of that, I believe anyway, that the Otis Group formed because there is a concern here about what it means politically for that constituency, coal workers, etc.
It's impossible to ignore the timing, isn't it, that the Otis Group, the first formation, the private formation in Otis, and then the bigger meeting in Kokomo's, that fits in neatly with that decision having been made at Cabinet, albeit it didn't leak out until just now. Andrew Clennell, thank you.
Thanks.